Now, I'll be moving to our next lecture. Our next topic is the impact of Arab and Arab-Israel normalization on the Palestinian cause. And to speak on that topic, we have Dr. Mosheer A Amer, who is Assistant Professor of Linguistics from the Islamic University of Gaza, and also he's the Director of the Center of Political and Development Studies. So I invite Dr. Mosheer A Amer to present his thoughts.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much for having me and for organizing this event. I would like to extend my greetings and appreciation to the Popular Front of India for organizing this important seminar, and also for the support of the Palestinian people's struggle for freedom and self-determination. The issue of normalization indeed is a very dangerous issue for the Palestinian people, with very serious and destructive ramifications for the whole Palestinian struggle and for the legitimacy of the Palestinian struggle, as I will try to delineate in a few minutes, inshallah. So if we begin by defining normalization, it is any participation in any activity, any event, any initiative or program that brings together Arabs, Palestinians, Muslims, or any individual or a group around the world on one side, and the Israeli Zionists on the other side. And this normalization activity is either individual or institutional, without taking at sort of its central plan, resisting Israel's colonialism, resisting Israel's ethnic cleansing and occupation. And therefore, when we think of normalization, we think that normalization treats Israel as a normal state, when in reality, when the facts on the grounds are quite to the contrary. Israel is not a normal state. Israel is not like Sweden or Norway or Finland or any other country or Switzerland. Israel is a Hitler colonial project that was built on the ruins, that was built on the ashes of the Palestinians, on the Palestinian society, and on the Palestinian people and land. It was built after the systematic depopulation of the Palestinian people and Palestinian lands, after this systematic ethnic cleansing that has been going on for almost a century. It is built on the disposition of the Palestinian people and is built on a matrix of oppressive measures, on a matrix of racist laws, the aim of which is to see sort of the Palestinian people vanish and not be present in their historical land. So basically, when we think of normalization, we are treating Israel as something that is normal, when it is not really the case. So by Israel trying to engage in all these sort of normalization projects with Arab states, now we've got like 4 Arab countries recently, in the recent year or so. Israel tries to create a shift in perception, a shift in the collective and the individual consciousness of Arabs, of Muslims, of Palestinians, and of all people around the world, that sees Israel as a normal state, as a civilized country, as a democracy in this world. But Israel is not really the case. It's not really so. Israel is, or it continues to engage in ethnic cleansing and brutal occupation. The most recent manifestation of this brutality is in the aggression on Gaza that ended just last week. 11 days of vicious, brutal, unabated attack against Palestinians, against Palestinian civilians, Palestinian civilian infrastructure in the Gaza Strip, as well as the ethnic cleansing in Al-Quds and the Judaization of Al-Quds, of Jerusalem, of Al-Quds and Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. And again, with this unabated, frenetic settler colonial activities in the West Bank, and with the imprisonment and the repeated aggressions all over Palestine, not simply in the lands occupied in 1967, but as we have seen in the lands occupied in 1948. So we as Palestinians, we as Arabs, we as Muslims, as free people, free conscientious people around the world, are in total rejection of Israel. We want to delegitimize Israel, not to grant it legitimacy, and not to treat it as something that that is normal, that is acceptable, that is part of this plan, the larger Middle East, the bigger, the larger or the greater Middle East. But we have to always make sure that Israel is treated as a brutal military occupation, as a colonization, as a settler colonial project, and therefore we totally reject all these attempts to normalize and to treat Israel as a normal state. Again, the idea of normalization and the efforts by the Israelis to normalize Israel is mainly, I think, it's at the consciousness level, which basically tries to, through which Israel tries to whitewash its crimes, to give the facade of a democracy, of a normal state that is basically living side by side with some Arab states, with some Palestinians. But that is to say, Israel seeks to find legitimacy in the eyes of the Arabs, in the eyes of the Palestinians, in the eyes of the Muslims all over the world. And again, Israel wants to see all the realities of the occupation, all the realities of ethnic cleansing, all the draconian measures exercised by Israel against the Palestinians, wherever they are, as something that can be acceptable, as something that can be accommodated, as something that can be legitimated, because we're treating, or those Arabs are treating Israel as something that is quite normal and unacceptable. But again, we as Muslims, we have to reject to the idea of giving legitimacy to Israel. As we have seen, have noticed and observed over the past year, I mean, there have been, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been bragging about his sort of normalization agreements, the Abraham sort of accord with Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and with Sudan. And this is really unfortunate to see that Arab countries who have been long sort of support of the Palestinian rights, been supportive of the Palestinian aspirations for freedom and self-determination, we've seen them that they're bowing down to Israel's and trying to sort of gloss over, to bypass the Palestinians, to sort of gloss over and actually scorn the Palestinian legitimate rights and the Palestinian legitimate demands and struggle for freedom. And they just want to forge relations with the Israeli occupation state. So we think that this is really a stab in the back of the Palestinians, a stab at the very heart of the Palestinian struggle, national struggle, moral struggle for freedom and self-determination, and for an end to the Israeli occupation. So basically, normalization also encourages Israel to continue what it has been doing against the Palestinian people over the past decades. Basically, it means that, yes, Israel can go on with its total denial of the Palestinian existence, of denial of the Palestinian rights and aspirations, and basically it can do business as usual, as they can say. So basically, this is really an attempt to whitewash Israel's and to give it legitimacy at our expense as Palestinians, at our expense as Muslims aspiring and struggling to free Palestine from all of this colonialism and an attempt to sort of end Palestine's colonization by the Israelis. So again, it is unacceptable for us, the Palestinians, and every conscientious person around the world to accept this kind of normalization. basically, what we really want as Palestinians, not really normalization, but actually BDS, a boycott. This is the least that we can do around the world. This is the least that Arabs and Muslims and every conscientious-based person around the world is to boycott Israel, to delegitimize Israel, to accept, impose sanctions on Israel, to divest from Israel, to disengage from any attempt to normalize at the sporting level, at the cultural level, at the academic level, at the economic level, at the political and diplomatic level, because these sort of boycott, this kind of boycott and divestment, BDS, is really, they sends the right message to the Israelis, but not only the Israelis, but also to those who normalize with the Israel, that this is not the proper course of action. We want to punish Israel for its crimes against the Palestinians. We want to punish Israel and those normalizers when they for what they've been doing to the Palestinian people. And the proper course also is that we cannot accept the legitimacy of Israel unless it complies with international law, unless it complies with the United Nations resolutions that basically and fundamentally called for the end of the occupation and granting the Palestinians their right of return, granting the Palestinians their right to self-determination and an end to the Israeli occupation. So boycotting is breaking off, not building relations with colonial Israel. It's a breaking off the cultural, political, economic, and military ties with the Israeli occupation. And it is an institutional, an official, or a formal choice, but boycott is also an individual choice that every individual in this world, and particularly in this respect, Muslims in India and everywhere, this is an individual choice by choosing to boycott Israel's products, by choosing to boycott any kind of engagement at sporting, at cultural, at academic, at economic level with Israel, because we cannot equate between the victim, the Palestinian victim, and the Israeli Zionist colonizer and the Israeli Zionist oppressor. This is what we really want our Arab brothers to do, and certainly what our Muslim brothers and sisters want to do is to engage in boycott, engage in divestment and sanctions against the Israeli occupation state, and certainly against those who normalize with Israel, because we want to punish them and to send them the right message that this is not the way to go. The way to go is to continue to single out Israel as a rogue state, as a pariah state, as a state that is built on dispossession of the Palestinian people, as built on the desecration of the Muslim holy lands, and a desecration of all fundamental human rights that we all struggle for restoring in the land of Palestine. So again, normalization is a treason to our values, our religion, our Islam, and our basic and fundamental rights in ending the occupation and in decolonizing Palestine. Also, normalization is very profitable to Israel, because as we have seen and read a lot, is that economically speaking, Israel has benefited a lot from its sort of relationship with Emirates, at sort of engaging in sort of a trade agreements and sporting and sort of exchange of tourism and things like that. So it is a good sort of investment for Israel, but it's a bad investment for the Arabs, because they can't get any benefit really from engaging with Israel, and they cannot really get any sort of economic revenues, but they are getting only shame and scandal. And clearly what we've seen over the past couple of weeks is that the whole Arab world, the Muslims around the world, are in total support of the Palestinian struggle for freedom. And definitely these who are normalizing with Israel have been really hiding in the shade, as they say, because they are shamed. They've been shamed for their cooperation and their normalization with the Israeli occupation state. So basically, and to end my brief talk here, is that we Muslims around the world, we have to stand very firm and assertively on on guarding the rights of the Palestinian people to freedom, and trying to delegitimize Israel and try to single it out as a settler colonial state. And it is rightly so. This is the kind of support that we really want from our brothers and sisters in India and Muslims around the world. Thank you very much.